Hello, good morning. Welcome back to my friend the Rainbow Circle. I'm here today to talk to you about birth defects. That's an exciting topic, right? That makes sense that I'm talking about it in terms of fiction writing. Um, no, but seriously, I'm trying to cover some of the stories in my Opal Bean War project, but connecting them to things that were already written. I have a whole series of stories about birth defects. And I was trying to think what sort of where I got that idea. Monstrous birth defects. Like, I have a series of stories where a character named Dave is born into a family of animals. Like, there's a family of shrimp that he's born into just as a human, and a family of rattlesnakes that he's born into. And then I flipped that around and had his family has all these animals born into the family just as these birth defects. Hush. My dogs are fighting. Speaking of wild animals, my dogs are fighting. I was trying to think where I got that from. My dogs are going to be crazy. Hold on. Anyway, that sort of monstrous birth defect it's a magical realist concept, but I was trying to think which magical realist story had that in it, and I was struggling to remember. But years ago, maybe 15 years ago, I did a conference presentation about how the X-Men were magical realist, and I think that's one of the significant contributions. Stan Lee, one of my heroes, Stan Lee, one of his significant contributions to comics is this notion of the mutants just being born with their powers and lacking explanation. I compare them to Kafka. Part of the power of Kafka is he'll have some sort of magical shift and there'll be no explanation, but the visceral impact of that is the lack of explanation. So, I mean, he'll do that really frequently with, a lot of his stories. Like the whole drive of the trial or the castle is, why was Joseph K. Arrested? And so the visceral impact of that is the lack of explanation. Who is Count West, and how do I get to him? The whole drive of that is the mystery. And birth defects are a really, really visceral sort of a thing to deal with, for sure. The way magical realism works, ultimately, I mean, the definition people give for it is that it's a otherwise realistic scenario with a magical element. I don't think that's really a full explanation of how magical realism works. The way magical realism really works, arguably it's more of a tone than it is, really specific elements. But the way magical realism works is, it's bathos as part of the technique, and I've talked about bathos before, where you have an abnormal element and people treat it as normal, and that creates a particular tone. But I think a big factor in it is lack of explanation. It's just a taken for granted mundane part of existence, and that creates a particular visceral impact. So if you think about my friend the Rainbow Circle, has to do with schematic breaking. So schema is just the internal rule system of the story. So if you're presenting a story as otherwise realistic, quote-unquote realistic, the schema of the story is realism. You have this expectation. Hey, here's another animal. Spike! Look at my lap. My cat Spike is out here too. You have this expectation that everything within the story is going to follow the rules of reality, quote-unquote reality. I think the term reality is overused a bit, but quote-unquote reality. And when you have something breaking with reality, that's a schematic break. It's not a universal flaw. Just saying something's unrealistic is not a universal flaw. You can really effectively shape a schematic break from quote-unquote reality to create a really significant visceral effect. And that's what that's what, Kafka does so well. That's what the magical realists do so well. It is you set up this tone really early on, that you have this really realistic scenario for the most part, and you set up the schema as realism, and then you have this magical element that inserts itself into the text. If you have a realistic scenario, you have a ghost, or you have a monster or something come into the scenario, that disrupts the schema and creates this really significant visceral effect. And depending on how people treat that magical element really determines the tone. Genre is another widely overused term, but you can think of it that way. But I think the much more significant reading of that is that it affects the visceral impact, or affects the tone of the text. So if everyone treats the monstrous character as mundane, as just part of their lives, the ghost, for example, is just part of their lives, it creates a very different tone. You interpret that as being part of the genre of magical realism. If everybody treats it as a source of terror, it creates a very, very different tone. It readjusts the schema in a very different way. And it becomes part of the genre horror. And so birth defects, I think, are just an interesting one to work with, because they are so deeply visceral. The reason why disruption of schema has such an impact is because schema is a small step towards in the direction of destimulation. So the core of the rainbow circle is pure stimulation, pure non-dualistic visceral impact, what have you, visceral abstraction. Schema is a step in the direction of giving it some order for the sake of comfort. So moving away from the stimulating core towards the outer rim of the rainbow circle is moving towards the comforting end of the spectrum. And schema is a mode of comfort. So if you see something that's really viscerally stimulating, if you recognize, oh, this is a horror story, it gives you a sense of comfort. Magical realism can be arguably more discomforting, because it takes that schema of realism and it presents a magical element and fails to explain it. So a birth defect happens, and there's really no explanation other than just being a birth defect. So it's much more unsettling in a different way, I should say. I love horror. I'm not insulting horror, but it's unsettling in a very different way. But in reality, you have all these sets of dualities, or these taken for granted ways in which nature works, that are very comforting. So if birth works the same way birth is supposed to, it's comforting. But if there's some sort of disruption to birth, it's very, very unsettling. And so I think that's one of the things that's the contribution of Stanley, one of my heroes, to the notion of superheroes. I mean, superheroes, they have this supernatural element, or they have this, sci-fi element, and just traditionally there's some sort of explanation. It's not always a believable explanation. It's like Superman flies because of the gravity is different on our planet. Sure. That's the John Carter explanation. If you think about it too much, it doesn't make sense. But if you just flew for no reason, that would be unsettling. And it could be so unsettling that you just dismiss it, of course. I mean, if just a lack of explanation, if you're not really effectively crafting it to create a visceral effect, it can be, it can lead to readers just dismissing it. So if somebody flies for no reason, it can be unsettling to the degree that people just stop reading. There's a novel called Heart Snatcher that I read on this porch, where people just start flying for no reason. It's a beautiful, it's Boris Vian. It's a beautiful novel. But then X-Men comes along. You know, we have all of these explanations for the origin of superheroes. X-Men comes along, and there's kind of sort of explanations every once in a while. But the superhero is just born, or the villain is just born with this power, which manifests in adolescence. I think that's a big part of the story as well, is that it manifests in adolescence. But and so everything about the X-Men is really, really, really unsettling in so many ways. And you know, especially a lot of the mutants, especially the Morlocks, have really grotesque sort of birth defects. So that's the lack of explanation and the intense visceral impact of the grotesque mutant powers just has a very, very different sort of visceral impact than just, you know, having, you know, you can have a monstrous superhero. Usually there's some sort of explanation, whether it's within a magic system. You know, Doctor Strange is one of my favorites of all time, and there's an explanation of everything, but it's within this schema, it's within this magic system. But one of my favorite X-Men comics, a really underrated one, was Generation X, and they really, well, Chris Bachalo or Bachalo, however you pronounce his name, is one of my favorite artists, so of course that's a big reason why that was one of my favorites. But one of my favorite characters from that was a guy named Chamber, and he had most of his front area was missing. I don't know if they ever really quite got into the horror aspect of that. I read most of the first few years of that, and I don't know if they ever really explored the just the horrific nature of just the first part. The front part of his body was just blown away. And you had Husk who ripped her skin off, and you had Skin who had all this extra skin. You had all these characters with really grotesque powers. And it's horrific. It's definitely horrific. You have to live with these grotesque powers. Ultimately, they treat them as mundane, and that's why I would argue that it's sort of magical realist, almost horrific magical realist comics. But I think ultimately that's the contribution of Stan Lee is moving beyond the necessity to explain where powers are, where powers come from. I don't know if any other comic really fully embraced the glory of lack of explanation. But you know, actually reading a good X-Men comic, I mean, it's soap opera. tonally, the schema is soap opera, of course. But when they deal with the superpowers, it tends to be tragic and horrific. But frequently, it will slip into the more magical realists sort of a tone. Like the recent stuff with Jonathan Hickman, which I haven't been able to read, but Jonathan Hickman has that more, you know, surreal, magical realist sort of approach. But anyway, we'll wrap it up for today. So, birth defects. Oh, as a side note, I've been writing about birth defects for 15 years now, I think. And my son just turned 8 not that long ago. And he was born with birth defects. Cutis laxa, hypertrichosis. Just harmless things, thankfully harmless things, knock on wood. But that was a weird, spooky sort of a thing. You know, when I found that out, I said, did my stories create this scenario? It was a very magical realist, sort of unsettling thing for sure. He was a little werewolf, clearly. Hair, lots and lots of hair is a genetic thing, of course. But he was a little werewolf, and he's my precious little werewolf. But anyway, that was kind of spooky. Hopefully I don't harm anyone with the magical power of my stories. But anyway, I'll see you on the next episode.